Morning light spilled through stained glass like liquid jewels, bathing the ancient cathedral in crimson, sapphire, and gold. Beneath soaring arches where generations of nobles had exchanged solemn vows, London's proudest families gathered in silken ranks, their whispers rising like restless birds before settling into expectant silence. Every polished boot, every jeweled tiara, every carefully folded fan testified that this was no ordinary wedding. It was an alliance upon which fortunes depended, reputations trembled, and old bloodlines hoped to survive another generation. Yet beneath the glorious spectacle lingered a sharper anticipation. Few believed the bride and groom stood before God because affection had guided them there. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe entered without haste, her ivory gown floating behind her like fresh snowfall across untouched fields. Tiny seed pearls shimmered along her veil, catching the morning light until she seemed almost fashioned from it. Her expression remained composed despite the countless eyes measuring every graceful step she took toward the altar. Behind lowered lashes she heard fragments of conversation drifting between respectable smiles. Her father's estates were drowning. The Duke deserved better. A fortunate bargain for the Ashcombes. Each sentence landed like invisible rain upon her shoulders, yet her chin never lowered. She had spent years learning that dignity often survived where happiness could not. If the world insisted upon mistaking sacrifice for ambition, she would answer with quiet grace rather than wounded protest. Only her tightly clasped bouquet betrayed the trembling hidden beneath elegant gloves. Waiting beside the altar stood Duke Adrian Ravenshire, impossibly still beneath the cathedral's towering columns. Tall, broad-shouldered, and severe in perfectly tailored black, he possessed the composed authority of a man accustomed to obedience before he spoke a single word. His striking features might have inspired admiration had they not been guarded by an expression carved from disciplined restraint. His gaze met Eleanor's only briefly, revealing neither welcome nor resentment, merely the impersonal acknowledgement one might offer an unavoidable obligation. Society praised his honor, envied his immense estates, and feared the unyielding standards by which he governed both tenants and peers. No one claimed to know his heart. The Archbishop's measured voice echoed through sacred stone, invoking duty, covenant, and divine witness. Eleanor repeated every vow with unwavering clarity, allowing each promise to leave her lips as though it carried genuine hope. Adrian answered in the same calm tone, precise and immaculate, never faltering, never lingering upon her face. Rings were exchanged beneath flickering candlelight while the congregation watched with breathless fascination. Applause quietly followed the final blessing, warm enough to satisfy etiquette but never quite disguising the curiosity simmering beneath polished manners. As guests turned toward the aisle, Adrian inclined his head just enough to conceal his lips from watching eyes. His voice remained perfectly courteous, scarcely louder than a passing breath. "Never talk to me. Fulfill your duty, and nothing more." The words entered Eleanor's heart with astonishing gentleness, which somehow made them infinitely crueler. She neither gasped nor stumbled. Instead, she continued smiling exactly as every newly crowned duchess ought, accepting congratulations while something fragile inside her settled into silence. No witness suspected that the marriage had ended before it had truly begun. Outside, bells rang triumphantly across the city as flower petals drifted upon cool spring air. Crowds cheered the glittering carriage carrying the Duke and Duchess toward Ravenshire House. Children waved enthusiastically, believing fairy tales still belonged to noble weddings. Eleanor returned every smile through the carriage window, careful never to glance toward the husband seated opposite her. Adrian spent the journey studying passing streets instead, his posture rigid, hands resting motionless upon a silver-topped cane inherited from generations of Ravenshire dukes. Between them stretched only a few feet of polished wood and velvet cushions, yet the distance felt immeasurable. Ravenshire House welcomed its new mistress with magnificent indifference. Marble staircases curved beneath crystal chandeliers while portraits of stern ancestors observed every arrival from gilded frames. Servants lined the entrance hall in immaculate rows, bowing respectfully as the couple crossed the threshold. At the center waited the Dowager Duchess, Adrian's widowed mother, resplendent in midnight silk adorned with glittering diamonds that reflected neither warmth nor celebration. She accepted Eleanor's respectful curtsy with measured approval before speaking for all assembled to hear. "Remember, Your Grace," she said smoothly, "a Ravenshire bride is admired most when she is seen, never noticed." Several guests laughed politely, disguising mockery as wit. Eleanor answered with serene gratitude, refusing to grant humiliation the satisfaction of visible pain. Adrian neither corrected his mother nor acknowledged the remark. His silence stood beside her more heavily than accusation ever could. The wedding breakfast unfolded beneath towering windows overlooking manicured gardens bright with white roses. Noblemen toasted alliances, ladies praised imported orchids, musicians filled pauses with delicate strings, yet Adrian deliberately chose the seat furthest from Eleanor. Whenever conversation required courtesy between husband and wife, servants carried messages instead of voices. Every absent glance, every measured omission, quietly instructed the room that affection held no place within this union. By twilight, Eleanor was escorted not toward the Duke's private chambers but into a beautifully appointed suite prepared solely for her. Rain whispered against tall windows as she removed her veil, believing solitude would become the truest companion of her marriage. Then a hesitant knock interrupted the silence, and an elderly maid entered carrying fresh white roses wrapped without any card, signature, or explanation. Dawn found Eleanor awake long before the household stirred, seated beside the rain-speckled window with the mysterious white roses resting across her lap. Their fragrance carried a freshness untouched by the cold grandeur surrounding her, as though someone had quietly smuggled spring itself into Ravenshire House. She searched every stem for a hidden message, every ribbon for a forgotten seal, yet discovered nothing beyond immaculate care. Whoever had chosen them wished to remain unseen. The anonymity puzzled her more deeply than any declaration ever could, for kindness offered without recognition possessed a rare sincerity that society seldom rewarded. The elderly maid who had delivered the bouquet smiled whenever Eleanor thanked her, though she insisted no servant knew the sender's identity. The flowers, she explained softly, had appeared each morning outside the servants' entrance, already arranged and accompanied only by instructions that they reach her grace before breakfast. Eleanor accepted the explanation with quiet curiosity. She had entered the household expecting little beyond polite indifference, yet invisible compassion had somehow crossed every rigid boundary separating masters from those who served them. That single mystery became the first gentle warmth she carried through otherwise lonely days. Life inside the ducal residence quickly settled into disciplined routine. Adrian departed early to oversee tenants, estate ledgers, and parliamentary obligations, returning after dusk with measured composure untouched by visible fatigue. Their encounters remained painfully brief. At breakfast he acknowledged Eleanor with a courteous inclination of his head before opening correspondence. During dinner he addressed practical matters through the butler whenever conversation became unavoidable. His command from the wedding day endured without repetition because she obeyed it perfectly. Silence gradually transformed from an imposed punishment into an invisible wall both seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to cross. Yet every third morning another anonymous gift appeared. One day it was a slim volume of poetry bound in pale blue leather, its verses speaking of endurance blooming beneath winter skies. Another morning brought ivory gloves embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots along the wrists, each stitch executed with remarkable patience. Later arrived a delicate silver music box that released a melancholy waltz whenever Eleanor wound its tiny key. None carried initials, family crests, or even the faintest clue. They felt neither extravagant nor improper, only thoughtful enough to suggest that someone observed her quiet sadness with extraordinary attention. Rumors flourished wherever certainty remained absent. Before long the ladies attending afternoon calls exchanged amused smiles over tea, wondering which gentleman had grown enchanted by Ravenshire's neglected duchess. Invitations arrived more frequently than before, curiosity proving stronger than friendship. Eleanor attended because duty required her presence, though she dreaded becoming another ornament displayed beneath crystal chandeliers while whispered speculation drifted between painted fans. Every ballroom glittered magnificently, every quartet performed flawlessly, yet she sensed herself watched less as a woman than as an unfolding scandal waiting for confirmation. Among those gatherings she repeatedly encountered Lord Julian Ashford, Adrian's oldest companion since boyhood. Julian possessed none of the Duke's formidable reserve. His laughter came easily, his courtesy never appeared rehearsed, and his eyes carried the comforting warmth of someone genuinely interested in the people before him. Unlike others, he never questioned Eleanor about anonymous gifts or repeated fashionable gossip disguised as concern. Instead, he spoke of literature, music, gardens, and charitable causes, choosing subjects that invited conversation without trespassing upon private wounds. Although Eleanor answered sparingly, his kindness gently reminded her that civility could still exist without hidden motives. Servants soon noticed that Julian always rose when the Duchess entered a room, even if every other gentleman remained comfortably seated. During dinners he discreetly ensured her wineglass never stood empty and rescued her from awkward silences with observations inviting polite responses. If she seemed tired, he shortened conversations rather than demanding cheerful performance. Such attentions remained entirely proper, yet in drawing rooms hungry for entertainment, restraint often inspired more dangerous fantasies than reckless passion. Whispers linked his name to the mysterious gifts with astonishing speed, each repetition polishing suspicion until it gleamed like accepted truth. Adrian never acknowledged the rumors aloud, but Eleanor occasionally sensed his distant gaze lingering a heartbeat longer whenever Julian happened to be nearby. The Duke's expression revealed nothing beyond habitual composure, though subtle changes escaped neither servants nor observant guests. His replies grew shorter. His jaw tightened whenever laughter carried across crowded rooms. Once, after Julian praised Eleanor's skill at the pianoforte before assembled company, Adrian quietly set down his untouched wineglass with enough force to fracture its delicate stem. He apologized immediately for the accident, yet silence afterward felt sharper than broken crystal. The height of the London season arrived with a grand charity garden reception hosted beneath flowering chestnut trees at a royal estate. Ladies wandered among marble fountains carrying embroidered parasols while military bands performed lively marches softened by birdsong. Eleanor accepted the invitations expected of her station, determined not to retreat from a society already eager to mistake dignity for defeat. Adrian accompanied her out of obligation, spending much of the afternoon conversing with ministers and influential landowners. Their paths scarcely crossed until guests gathered upon broad stone terraces overlooking blooming rose gardens. As Eleanor descended the polished marble steps, the edge of her gown caught beneath one satin slipper. She lost balance for only an instant before Julian reached her side with effortless grace, steadying her gloved hand before she could fall. Relief softened her anxious smile. Remaining the impeccable gentleman, he bowed respectfully over her fingers and brushed the faintest kiss across the white kid leather, a gesture perfectly acceptable within aristocratic custom. Yet across the terrace Adrian witnessed the moment. His stillness became unmistakable, his eyes darkened with something no title could command into silence, and when Eleanor turned toward him, she realized the cold distance between them had finally learned the dangerous language of jealousy. The carriage journey home unfolded beneath gathering clouds, while silence settled between Adrian and Eleanor with heavier consequence than ever before. Rain streaked across the windows, blurring hedgerows into wavering shadows, yet neither looked outside for long. Eleanor folded her gloved hands together, replaying the innocent courtesy that had somehow ignited the Duke's unmistakable stare. She had neither invited Lord Julian's gesture nor encouraged society's restless imagination, but she sensed that explanations offered now would sound suspicious simply because they existed. Adrian remained motionless opposite her, every measured breath concealing emotions he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. The moment they reached Ravenshire House, Adrian disappeared into the western wing without a word. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the rigid determination in his stride. Before the evening lamps had fully illuminated the corridors, a footman quietly summoned Lord Julian to the Duke's private study. The invitation carried no warmth, only obligation. Julian arrived punctually, removed his gloves, and entered the oak-paneled room where firelight flickered across shelves lined with generations of leather-bound histories. Adrian stood beside the mantelpiece, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the commanding nobleman whose patience had finally reached its limit. For several long moments neither man spoke. The crackling fire seemed louder than conversation itself. Adrian's gaze remained fixed upon Julian with restrained intensity before he finally broke the silence. "Are you courting my wife?" The question emerged calmly, yet every syllable carried the weight of accusation carefully restrained by discipline. Julian neither flinched nor answered hastily. Instead, he regarded his oldest friend with quiet disappointment rather than offense. "No," he replied. "But someone should have." Those 6 words struck Adrian more sharply than open insult could have managed. They contained neither mockery nor triumph, only painful truth. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice with respectful gravity. "You mistake kindness for betrayal because you have forgotten the difference between distance and dignity." Adrian offered no defense. Julian inclined his head politely before leaving the study, allowing the heavy door to close behind him. Left alone, the Duke stared into the flames until their restless movement reflected inside his own troubled thoughts. That night Adrian wandered the corridors long after the household retired. For the first time since the wedding, his attention shifted away from preserving emotional distance toward observing the woman he had deliberately ignored. The next morning he paused unnoticed outside the estate kitchens and watched Eleanor kneel beside a frightened scullery maid whose apron had torn while carrying heavy baskets. Rather than summon another servant, Eleanor patiently repaired the damaged fabric herself with neat, practiced stitches. She smiled gently throughout the task, accepting grateful thanks as though kindness required no audience. Later that afternoon Adrian reviewed household accounts inside the steward's office. Amid ordinary ledgers lay several receipts bearing Eleanor's discreet signature. Curious despite himself, he examined them carefully and discovered payments supporting a nearby orphanage whose roof had recently collapsed during violent storms. The donations came not from Ravenshire funds but from jewels Eleanor had quietly sold through a trusted jeweler in London. She had surrendered treasured heirlooms while asking that her generosity remain anonymous. Adrian closed the ledger slowly, unsettled by the realization that strangers knew more of his wife's compassion than her own husband did. Days passed, and his observations multiplied. Eleanor read aloud to elderly servants whose failing eyesight prevented them from enjoying books they once loved. She arranged baskets of food for tenant families suffering poor harvests, always insisting the provisions appear to come from the estate rather than herself. Every evening she wrote letters of encouragement to widows she had met through charitable work, sealing each envelope with simple wax instead of ducal insignia. Never once did she complain about her marriage or seek sympathy for her loneliness. Her silence, he gradually understood, was not weakness but extraordinary restraint. The discoveries awakened memories Adrian had spent years burying beneath discipline. As a young boy he had watched his mother abandon the family for another man whose promises glittered more brightly than loyalty. His father's heartbreak had transformed a once cheerful household into a mausoleum governed by disappointment and distrust. Love, Adrian learned, invited humiliation before it offered comfort. When his father finally died, bitterness lingered longer than grief. The young Duke inherited vast estates alongside a private conviction that affection inevitably became a weapon. Better to remain distant than risk becoming vulnerable enough to lose everything again. Marriage to Eleanor had never challenged that belief until jealousy forced him to confront its consequences. He had imagined emotional detachment would protect them both from future suffering. Instead, he had condemned an innocent woman to bear punishment for sins committed by people she had never known. The realization settled upon him with painful clarity, stripping away the comforting illusion that coldness equaled strength. Pride suddenly resembled cowardice wearing elegant clothes. One storm-laden evening, thunder rolled across the countryside while candlelight shimmered through the mansion's long galleries. Restless and unable to sleep, Adrian followed the faint sound of piano music drifting from the music room. The melody unfolded with aching tenderness, each note lingering like an unspoken prayer beneath the high-painted ceiling. He paused unseen within the doorway, watching Eleanor seated alone before the grand instrument. Her fingers moved gracefully across polished ivory keys, yet sorrow shaped every phrase more eloquently than words ever could. The final chord dissolved into silence. Without turning, Eleanor rested trembling hands upon the keyboard and spoke softly into the empty room. "Your Grace," she said, "I know you are there." Adrian stepped forward, startled that she had sensed him despite the storm. She remained facing the piano. "I have obeyed your command," she continued. "I have not spoken unless necessity demanded it. Yet silence can wound more deeply than anger, because it leaves no place for forgiveness." Each sentence carried neither accusation nor bitterness, only weary honesty. Adrian searched for the apology he had denied himself since their wedding day, but before any words reached his lips, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. A breathless footman appeared at the doorway holding the latest London newspaper, his face drained of colour. Across its front page spread a sensational headline proclaiming that the Duchess of Ravenshire and Lord Julian Ashford had become society's newest secret romance. London devoured the newspaper story with ravenous delight. By noon, whispers had spread from Mayfair drawing rooms to parliamentary corridors, embroidered with fresh invention at every retelling. Some claimed Eleanor and Julian had exchanged secret letters. Others insisted they had been seen walking unchaperoned through Kensington Gardens. The truth mattered far less than the pleasure of scandal. A neglected duchess and a charming lord formed a narrative too irresistible for society to surrender. Invitations arrived addressed to Adrian alone, while Eleanor's name quietly disappeared from guest lists that had once courted her presence out of curiosity. Ravenshire House grew colder with each passing day. Servants lowered their voices when Eleanor entered a room. The Dowager Duchess received callers with brittle smiles and spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings that required careful management. Julian attempted to visit and explain himself, but Eleanor declined the meeting. She would not permit his kindness to become another weapon turned against him. More painful still was Adrian's silence. Since the night in the music room, he had neither accused her nor defended her. He moved through the house like a man wrestling unseen ghosts, and his restraint cut more deeply than anger ever could. On the third morning after the article appeared, Eleanor stood in the conservatory among pale orchids and damp fern leaves, reading yet another anonymous note of sympathy that concealed eager curiosity beneath elegant phrasing. She folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the others. "How exhausting it must be," she murmured to the flowers, "to have one's honor debated by people who have never once asked for the truth." She did not realize Adrian had entered behind her. He watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Why did you refuse to see Ashford?" The question startled her, not because of its content, but because he had addressed her directly. "Because he has already suffered enough for showing me ordinary courtesy," she replied quietly. Adrian's jaw tightened. "And what of you?" Eleanor met his gaze with weary composure. "I have been suffering since our wedding day, Your Grace. Society's gossip is merely louder than the rest." For the first time, he had no defense. That evening the season's grandest royal ball illuminated the palace with 1,000 candles reflected in mirrored walls. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead while strings performed beneath painted ceilings crowded with cherubs and clouds. Dukes, ambassadors, and ladies glittering with diamonds moved through the ballroom in currents of silk and velvet. Yet when Eleanor entered on Adrian's arm, conversation faltered almost imperceptibly, like a candle trembling before a draught. Several gentlemen who ordinarily would have sought an introduction suddenly found urgent reasons to look elsewhere. A cluster of ladies lowered their fans just enough to exchange knowing smiles. Eleanor felt the familiar burn of public judgment and prepared herself to endure another evening with quiet dignity. Then Adrian did something no one expected. Instead of guiding her toward the edge of the room and disappearing into political conversation, he remained beside her. He acknowledged greetings without releasing her arm. When a viscount offered a hesitant bow to Eleanor but addressed his remarks solely to the Duke, Adrian answered coolly, "You appear to have overlooked my wife." The viscount flushed and corrected himself immediately. Across the ballroom, Julian watched in astonished silence. As the orchestra began a waltz, Adrian turned to Eleanor. "May I have this dance, my wife?" The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a public declaration. For one suspended heartbeat she could only stare at him. Then she placed her gloved hand in his. They stepped onto the dance floor together, and the ballroom seemed to inhale as one. Adrian's hand settled at her waist with careful restraint, as though he feared even now he might break something precious through clumsy force. Eleanor felt the steady strength beneath his composure, the tension he usually concealed beneath icy manners. They moved through the waltz with unexpected harmony, turning beneath rivers of candlelight while whispers followed them like drifting smoke. "You need not do this for appearances," she said softly. "I know," he replied. Nothing more was spoken, yet the admission altered the air between them. When the dance ended, a baron known for sharp humor approached with a smirk he believed charming. "London is delighted to see such remarkable reconciliation, Your Grace. One hears the Duchess inspires uncommon devotion among gentlemen." The implication hung unmistakably in the glittering air. Adrian's expression hardened into something far colder than wounded pride. He spoke with quiet authority that carried across the nearest circle of guests. "Anyone who questions the Duchess of Ravenshire's honor questions mine." Silence fell. The Baron paled and bowed at once. In aristocratic society, no defense could have been stronger. Adrian had bound his own reputation to Eleanor's before witnesses whose opinions shaped London itself. The scandal did not vanish in that instant, but it lost its power. Conversations shifted. Fans lowered. Men who had avoided Eleanor now hurried to request introductions they had suddenly remembered they desired. Yet the greatest change was not in the ballroom. It was in the way Adrian looked at her afterward, not as an obligation, nor a political alliance, but as a woman whose pain he had finally begun to see. Near midnight they returned to Ravenshire House through streets silvered by moonlight. Eleanor retired quietly, uncertain whether hope was wisdom or merely another form of vulnerability. Adrian remained awake, restless beneath the strange relief and regret battling within him. At last he entered his private study. Upon his desk stood a fresh arrangement of white roses. Beside them lay a folded note in unfamiliar handwriting. For the first time since the gifts had begun, the anonymous sender had revealed a clue. Adrian broke the seal and read the opening line. "Your Grace, I can no longer watch the Duchess suffer without your knowing why I began sending the flowers." The note trembled slightly between Adrian's fingers, though his hands had remained steady through negotiations, funerals, and every hardship expected of a duke. The elegant script belonged not to an aristocrat but to someone accustomed to careful, deliberate penmanship. It asked him to come alone to the old rose garden before sunrise, promising answers that could no longer remain hidden. Sleep abandoned him entirely. Long after the household settled into silence, he remained seated before the dying fire, the white roses filling the room with the same quiet fragrance that had comforted Eleanor from the first lonely night of their marriage. Morning arrived beneath a veil of silver mist. Adrian crossed dew-covered lawns toward the oldest corner of the estate, where climbing roses embraced weathered stone walls built by ancestors long forgotten. Waiting beside a marble fountain stood Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the elderly housekeeper whose faithful service had spanned nearly 5 decades. She curtsied with respectful composure, though her eyes betrayed gentle concern rather than fear. "I beg your forgiveness, Your Grace," she said softly. "The flowers were my doing." Adrian stared at her in astonishment. "You?" She nodded. "I watched the Duchess arrive with hope hidden behind brave manners. I watched her dine alone, walk alone, and bear every slight without complaint. No young bride should believe herself entirely unseen. I could not change your heart, but I could remind hers that kindness still existed beneath this roof." She reached into the basket beside her and lifted the familiar blue-bound book of poetry. The gifts were chosen because they asked for nothing in return. I feared that if my name appeared, Her Grace would thank me from duty rather than accept them as comfort. Adrian lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by a shame no public accusation had ever awakened. "A servant showed my wife more compassion than her own husband." Mrs. Holloway's expression remained tender. "No, Your Grace. A lonely old woman merely offered what she hoped someone else would one day continue." She placed the basket into his hands before quietly leaving the garden, allowing the silence to complete what her words had begun. Adrian remained among the roses long after she disappeared. Around him, blossoms opened patiently toward the morning sun, asking neither permission nor applause before revealing their beauty. For years he had mistaken distance for discipline, believing restraint made him honorable. Instead, he had hidden behind old wounds until kindness had become the courage he lacked. His father had allowed betrayal to poison an entire lifetime. Adrian suddenly understood he had nearly repeated the same tragedy, not through faithlessness, but through fear. Without hesitation he ordered the carriage prepared. Eleanor had spent the morning visiting the orphanage she quietly supported beyond the village. The children greeted her with laughter that filled the modest halls more richly than any palace orchestra. She helped distribute bread, listened to lessons, and tied ribbons into little girls' unruly curls before preparing to return home. As she stepped into the courtyard, Adrian's carriage arrived through the open gates. The sight of him standing beside it, rather than waiting inside, surprised every soul present. He approached slowly, carrying the basket Mrs. Holloway had entrusted to him. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. There was no command in his voice. Only hope. Eleanor searched his face, finding none of the familiar coldness that had greeted her since their wedding day. She nodded quietly, and together they wandered toward the estate's rose gardens where spring blossoms stretched beneath a cloudless sky. Birds sang among ancient hedges while sunlight shimmered across quiet fountains. Neither hurried to disturb the peace with unnecessary words. At last Adrian stopped beneath an arch woven entirely with white roses. "I know who sent them," he said. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I wondered whether the mystery would ever end." It was Mrs. Holloway. Her eyes widened with astonishment before soft gratitude softened her expression. "I should have guessed. I should have been the one bringing them." The confession lingered between them. Adrian drew a slow breath. "I believed silence would protect us both. My mother betrayed my father, and I watched love destroy the strongest man I ever knew. I promised myself I would never become so vulnerable. When our marriage was arranged, I decided distance would spare us disappointment." His voice faltered for the first time. "Instead, I became the source of yours." Eleanor listened without interruption. He continued, "I asked you to enter my life while refusing to let you enter my heart. Every lonely meal, every unanswered kindness, every cruel silence was my choice. You deserved honesty, respect, and companionship. I offered none of them." He lowered his eyes. "I cannot erase what I have done." For a long moment only birdsong filled the garden. Then Eleanor spoke with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every humiliation. "I often wondered whether I had failed before I ever began. I searched myself for faults I could correct, believing that if I became gentler, wiser, or more patient, perhaps you would one day speak to me as your wife instead of your obligation." Her voice trembled. "The hardest part was never your anger. It was believing I was unworthy of your kindness." Adrian closed the distance between them. Carefully, almost reverently, he took her gloved hand into his own. It was the first time he had held it without ceremony. His thumb brushed lightly across her fingers before he bowed his head and pressed a gentle kiss upon her hand, the very gesture that had awakened his jealousy weeks before. When he looked up, his eyes no longer hid behind pride. "I once commanded you never to speak to me," he whispered. "Now I ask something entirely different. Never again carry your sorrow in silence. If you will grant me another chance, let every joy, every fear, every ordinary thought find its way first to me. Not because I am your duke, but because I wish, at last, to become your husband." Tears shimmered within Eleanor's eyes, though none escaped. Forgiveness did not arrive because pain had vanished. It arrived because repentance had become unmistakably sincere. She placed her free hand over his. "Then we shall begin today." No grand speech followed. None was needed. The seasons turned gently after that morning. Ravenshire House gradually transformed from a monument to solemn duty into a home filled with music, laughter, and open doors. The Duke and Duchess restored village schools, expanded the orphanage together, and hosted gatherings where servants and tenants were treated with uncommon generosity. Mrs. Holloway's white roses bloomed each spring beside new varieties Eleanor planted with her own hands, their fragrance forever reminding them that the smallest kindness had rescued a marriage titles alone could never sustain. In time, London forgot the scandal but remembered something far rarer, a proud duke who learned that true nobility was measured not by inherited rank or commanding words, but by the humility to admit his failures, the courage to change his heart, and the quiet devotion to cherish the woman he had once condemned to silence until love finally taught him how to listen.